Okay, now we will start. We are going to continue with the general mechanisms in endocrine physiology. And this is one general overview that will be helpful to understand the functioning of individual hormones. And these concepts will be important to understand the actions of particular hormones. And today we will study the hormone receptors and how the hormones they carry out the actions in the target cells. The mechanism of action of individual hormone will be specific, but here we are talking about the general mechanisms, which different mechanisms the hormones utilize to carry out their action in the target cells. Now to begin with, there is one question for you. Try to answer this one. Okay, let's talk one by one. We have to classify the hormones, the given hormones, according to their solubility, whether they are water soluble or lipid soluble. Insulin is water soluble. Peptide hormone, water soluble. Okay. Then adrenaline. All of us try to answer. It may be right or wrong, that does not matter. If it is correct, okay. If not correct, we will revise it. No problem. Okay, insulin is water soluble. Good. Adrenaline. It is water soluble. But it is again water soluble. Amine, water soluble. Thyroxine. Thyroid hormone. Okay.
Water soluble.
Thyroxine.
Water soluble.
Water soluble.
Okay, your opinions are different here. And try to recall from our last class. Though it is amine, it is lipid soluble, not water soluble. Okay. Peptides are water soluble. Steroids are lipid soluble. Amines, the catecholamines, including adrenaline, they are water soluble, but thyroid hormones, though they are amines, they are lipid soluble. It is straightforward for peptide hormones, water soluble. Steroid hormones, lipid soluble. But for amines, thyroid hormones are lipid soluble, but adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, or they are combinedly called catecholamines. They are water soluble. Now you can say corticosteroids.
Lipid soluble.
Steroids.
Lipid soluble.
But steroids derived from cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid, therefore they are lipid soluble. Water soluble substances, they are not, like substances are dissolved in like substances, means lipids are dissolved in lipids. Okay, corticosteroid it is lipid soluble. Okay, good. Now knowledge of this solubility is very important to understand other mechanisms. For example, transport in blood. We have seen water soluble substances, they are transported, dissolved in water in plasma. For lipid soluble substances, because the plasma is water, lipid soluble substances, they cannot be transported effectively. They have to be dissolved first, and this occurs by binding with other water soluble substances, proteins. That is one implication of solubility in transport. Now today, for mechanism of action also, they have the difference. We will see it. This is the answer for the first slide, and we have discussed it. Now, from our first class, we have seen the role of hormones and neurotransmitters and other substances, messengers, is to regulate cellular activities, to control the cells and tissues. Outline. Now, from our previous discussion, we are going into somewhat more detail. Release of an intracellular messenger, that may be neurotransmitter, hormone. Here we are talking about hormones. Okay. The first step for this action is release of the intracellular messenger from the source. For example, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. We are taking this example because you already know about it. Antidiuretic hormone, release of this hormone from the posterior pituitary. Now it is transported through blood and it interacts with target cells in the nephrons, collecting ducts. Okay, then what happens after there is interaction on the receptors in the target cell? The next step is intracellular events. There are various intracellular events and they differ according to the hormones. Here we are combinedly saying intracellular events. And then after the intracellular events, that is the events inside the cells, various chemical reactions inside the cells. And then there is finally cell response. And in this case, in case of ADH, in the nephrons, it is increased number of aquaporins for water reabsorption in the collecting duct, luminal side. You already know it. And here the main idea is one component is cell-to-cell communication through the messenger hormone. And another component is once the hormone interacts with the target cell, there are the events inside the cell finally leading to some cell response. And this cell response determines or is same as the function of the cells or the target tissue. We are calling it cell response here. And this process from interaction of the hormone with the target cell till the cell response, it is called signal transduction. I think you have already studied in first year, general physiology, signal transduction. Okay, just remember this term, signal transduction. Okay, and this first step is cell-to-cell communication. It is between the cells, and signal transduction is inside the cell. And mechanism of action of hormones refers to what happens during this signal transduction in case of the hormones. Okay, the cell responses may be in the various forms. For example, change in cell membrane permeability by change in permeability to different ions or other substances. Membrane permeability, cell membrane permeability. And you have already seen when cell membrane permeability changes, there will be excitation or inhibition of the cells. Very common mechanism in case of neurotransmitters and also in hormones. Metabolism, there will be some change in metabolic rate or particular mechanism inside the cell. Maybe synthesis of various substances or their degradation, catabolism, anabolism, different mechanisms. Secretion, the excited cell may secrete some substance, other substance. We call it secretion. And in case of some cells, it may be contraction. In case of muscles, here smooth muscles and cardiac muscles through action of hormones. Or it may be proliferation or differentiation. Proliferation means formation of new cells, and differentiation means they mature to a certain line to form certain particular type of cells or tissues. Okay, one hormone may act on the cell to produce one or more of these responses, and the response will be mostly one of these or more. Okay, one or more of these. Therefore, the final response of the cell once the hormone acts on the cell will be these cell responses, and these responses mediate the particular functions of those target cells or tissues. Now, to go into more detail about the mechanism of action of hormones, the first step of hormones action is to bind with specific receptors at the target cell. Okay, remember the term specific means a particular hormone will act on particular receptors, not all receptors, and this in turn means binding of the hormone with the receptors in the target cell. This in turn activates various intracellular events to produce cell response. And one may ask what a receptor is. It is a protein or glycoprotein to which the chemical messenger binds and initiates cell response. Here the receptors are mainly proteins and in some cases glycoproteins to which the chemical messenger, means here hormones, bind, and then the signal transduction occurs to produce cell response. Okay, now try to attempt this one. Okay, a hormone can bind easily with receptors for all other hormones. Okay, all of you try to.
False.
Okay, false. Good. Because the action is specific. Okay, a particular hormone with a particular receptors. Is it possible that there may be different subtypes of receptor for hormone? Can one hormone act on multiple subtypes of the receptors? Yes or no?
No.
If yes, give examples. One hormone acting on different subtypes of receptors. Think of autonomic nervous system, for example. Adrenaline, noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is one neurotransmitter, and adrenaline and noradrenaline are also hormones also. Therefore, the receptors, there may be subtypes of adrenergic receptors. You know, alpha receptors, beta receptors, for example. Therefore, one chemical substance may have different subtypes of receptors. Now, let's think it other way. Can two different substances act on the same receptor?
Yes.
Yes.
फिजियोलोजिकल एन्टागोनिस्टहरू एउटै रिसेप्टरमा डिफ्रेन्ट एक्सन गर्छन्.
That is the basis of action of many drugs also. Okay? Chemically related hormones or substances may act on the same receptor also. Okay? For example, adrenaline, noradrenaline. They have some chemical similarity and difference also. They are called two substances because there are chemical differences, but they are chemically related also. Therefore, in the same receptor, say beta receptor, both of them can act, but their affinity may be different. For example, for beta receptors, adrenaline has more affinity. Affinity means the ability to bind with. Therefore, generally we say the hormones, they have specific receptors, but it is possible that one hormone may have different subtypes of the receptors to bind with. And in the other way, chemically similar two hormones can act on the same receptor, though the affinity may be different. Okay. At least understand the receptors are specific, but it is not 100% true. Next, each of the hormones has receptors distributed uniformly throughout the body. True or false? The action of the hormones will not be same on all cells or tissues or organs. Okay, but some hormones may have more widespread effect, others have more localized. For example, say ADH, antidiuretic hormone. The receptors are more concentrated in the distal segments of the nephrons, say collecting duct, but not in proximal ones. Therefore, according to their function, the location of the receptors will vary according to the locations. Okay. Now see this figure. One secretory cell secretes one chemical messenger. It is hormone for our case here. And this hormone, by this colored square rectangle, it shows the structure of the receptors on the target cell. Cell A has a receptor that fits with the messenger. It will respond to the chemical messenger, but here cell B, it does not have the receptors to fit into this messenger, and similarly cells C does not have this one. And this property is called specificity of the receptors. Now, location of the hormone receptors. The first step for action of the hormones is to bind with the receptors. Now, we will talk about the location of the hormone receptors in the cell. And there are three possibilities. In case of some hormones, the receptors are located on the surface of the cell membrane. And these are the examples. In case of protein or peptide hormones, catecholamine hormones. And you know these are water-soluble hormones. And can you think of why water-soluble hormones, they would have surface receptors? Can you correlate it with...
They cannot pass through the cell membrane because it is not lipid soluble.
Okay, good, very good, excellent. The water-soluble hormones, they cannot cross the cell membrane easily because the cell membrane consists of lipids, phospholipids, bilayer, and proteins. But area-wise, most of the area is composed of the phospholipids. By weight, proteins and lipids, they are almost equal. Proteins even greater. But by surface area, lipid portion occupies more area. And therefore, the protein molecules or water-soluble molecules, they cannot easily cross the cell membrane, lipid portion. Therefore, the advantage of the location of the receptors on the cell surface in case of these water-soluble hormones is obvious. Okay? Cell cytoplasm. The receptors are located in the cell cytoplasm for steroid hormones. We know steroid hormones are water-soluble, therefore they can easily cross the cell membrane, and the receptors will be in the cytoplasm. And for some hormones, for thyroid hormones, the receptors are within the nucleus. And we can say these receptors on the surface of the cell as surface receptors, cell surface receptors. And these 2 and 3, these are intracellular receptors. And some say these as nuclear receptors. Nuclear receptors may include cytoplasmic receptors also, according to some authors. Okay? If you categorize into 3, you will say surface, cytoplasm, and nucleus. If you have to give a classification with 2 categories, surface and nuclear, and in that case, cytoplasmic receptors will be included in nuclear receptors. Now, another way to classify the receptors is the mechanisms, what happens after the binding of the hormone with the receptors. And these are 4 classes. Ion channel linked receptors means the receptors, they are linked with, they are associated with ion channels. G protein coupled receptors. These receptors are coupled with or linked with G proteins, associated with G proteins. We will see what G proteins are. And another class of receptors, enzyme linked receptors. These receptors themselves have enzymatic activity, or they are closely related to some other enzyme. And another one is intracellular receptors or nuclear receptors. This is again similar to the classification according to the location, and their mechanism will be to change the transcription of mRNA. We will see it soon. To revise, ion channel linked, G protein linked or coupled, enzyme linked, and nuclear or intracellular receptors that mediate transcription. And you can see here one figure for ion channel linked receptors. And once the receptor and the hormone, they interact. In other words, when the hormone molecule, we also call them first messenger, because the second messengers are the intracellular messengers and first messengers are the extracellular or intercellular messengers. First messenger here is hormone molecule. This molecule, hormone molecule, binds with a receptor on the cell surface. See here, this is cell membrane, lipid layer, and this protein portion. And we know the receptors are the proteins, and you can see here the cell surface receptors are actually the proteins in the cell membrane, where we know that the cell membrane consists of phospholipid and proteins, and these receptors belong to those proteins. When there is binding of the hormone molecule with the receptor, there will be binding site on the receptor. This interaction will activate the receptor, and activation of the receptors will open one ion channel associated with the receptor. In other words, the receptor itself is a part of ion channel, or it has its intrinsic ion channel. You can see here the ion channel opens, and there will be the response, and which will be either influx or outflux of certain ion. And this ion channel activating mechanism or ion channel linked receptor activation is more common in case of neurotransmitters. It is not as common in case of hormones. When we classify receptors, we do not only think of hormones, and we also think of other chemical messengers, including neurotransmitters. This type of activation or receptor activation is more common in case of neurotransmitters, but not so common or rare in case of hormones. It is said that some receptors for noradrenaline belong to this one, but most of adrenergic receptors, they belong to another group. Just remember the name, and also remember it is a rare type of hormone receptor. Now second, G protein linked receptor activation, and it is also a cell surface receptor, because out of those four categories, that is ion channel linked, the ion channel linked receptors, G protein linked receptors, and enzyme linked receptors, they are surface receptors. They are part of the cell membrane, and they are cell membrane proteins. And you can see here this G protein linked receptor, this part is receptor. You can see this looping out and in structure, and this is receptor. Okay, and it is coupled with, linked with this G protein. This one is 3 subunits. It has 3 subunits, and it is G protein. Therefore, it is called G protein linked receptor. This one is receptor, and this one is G protein. When the receptor is activated by binding of the hormone, the response is activation of this G protein. And this G protein activation will activate other intracellular mechanisms, and finally the response. Okay, there is one question from you. Physiological antagonists ले एउटै रिसेप्टरमा एक्ट गर्छ र भने छैन. Physiological antagonists. Okay, there was one question. Do physiological antagonists act on same receptors? And one answer is also there from yourself. But what do you think?
No, sir.
Physiological antagonists, they are called antagonists in the sense that they have opposite physiological action. Okay, for example, one substance or one messenger may increase heart rate and another decrease heart rate. For example, increasing heart rate, noradrenaline, decreasing acetylcholine. In most of the cases, the substances will be different to regulate these mechanisms, physiological mechanisms, to keep the balance. And the messengers are different and vastly different. Therefore, the receptors will not be same, different. And we have given one example here, adrenaline and histamine. Okay, in what sense are they antagonists? You may have thought of adrenaline, vasoconstrictor, and histamine, vasodilator. Is it right? In that sense, they are antagonists. But remember that even a same substance can have opposite effects onto different sites or through different receptors. For example, adrenaline through beta receptors, it causes relaxation of the muscle, vasodilation. But through alpha receptors, though affinity is less, it causes vasoconstriction. The main point here is, in case of physiological antagonism, that is, to have opposite effects on the same tissue, the substances are not chemically related, and therefore the receptors will also be different. But in case of pharmacological antagonists, that is in case of drugs, in most of the cases, the antagonist means they bind with the same receptor but do not produce any action. Okay, now I think it is more clear. Okay, and in case of physiology, this physiological antagonist term is not commonly used, but in pharmacology it is very common. Okay, we are talking about G protein linked or coupled receptors, and you can study the details of the mechanism from book. For now, I will not go into much detail. Just remember that they are called G protein coupled receptors because this seven membrane segment, this protein or receptor is linked to intracellular protein, another protein, which is G protein. And it is called G protein because it binds with GTP or GTP. Okay, whenever the hormone molecule binds with the receptor, it will have change in its intracellular domain at some structural change, conformational change in shape, and that will interact with this G protein, and G protein bind with G protein, and it will be activated, and then the activated G protein will mediate other effects. Therefore, it is called G protein coupled. The receptor is linked with intracellular protein called G protein. And after activation of G protein, what happens? And there are different possibilities. And different hormones may use different of the one or more of these possibilities. For example, opening or closing of cell membrane ion channels. In case of ion-linked receptors, the receptor itself contains the ion channel. Therefore, the activation is direct. If the ion channel, membrane ion channel, is activated through activation of G protein, it is indirect, and the receptors will be called G protein linked receptors, not ion channel linked ones. Or there may be change in activity of an enzyme in the cytoplasm. And again, to compare with enzyme linked receptors, this enzyme is not very directly related to the receptor. In case of enzyme linked, the receptor itself has enzymatic action, or it is related very closely to another enzyme. In case of G protein coupled receptors, their activation will mediate the response through activation of enzymes, but these enzymes are not very directly related to G protein. And another mechanism is activate gene transcription. Again, it is a mechanism, direct mechanism for the nuclear receptors. But indirectly, the G protein activation can also lead to gene transcription. And also note that some hormones are coupled to inhibitory G proteins. They are called GI proteins. And some others, they are coupled to stimulatory G proteins. Means in case of GI proteins, there will be activation of the enzymes, in most cases adenylyl cyclase. And in case of stimulatory, there will be activation of adenylyl cyclase, and in case of inhibitory, there will be inhibition of that enzyme. Now, enzyme linked receptor activation and binding of the hormone molecule to this type of receptor will directly activate the enzyme, or it is very closely associated with another enzyme, and that will be activated. Examples are insulin. Insulin has enzyme linked receptors, growth hormone also, leptin also, and these are examples. For now, try to remember some examples, 2-3 examples for each type of receptors. In case of ion channel linked, which is not common, the examples are also rare. And in this case, the enzyme is mostly the tyrosine kinase. Tyrosine is one amino acid, and kinase means it phosphorylates some other substances, other enzymes as well, intracellular enzymes. And this gives an example of one enzyme linked receptor, taking example of insulin. And the detailed mechanisms we will study later under insulin. For now, just remember that when insulin molecules bind with the receptor, there will be activation of tyrosine kinase, and then it will activate other enzymes inside the cell, and the results, the cell response will be increase in glucose transport here. More transporters are synthesized and they are carried to the plasma membrane, so that more glucose is transported in the cell. We know the mechanism of action of insulin. One mechanism is to increase glucose uptake by the cells, and this is the mechanism here. Okay, and other responses are also possible. Different responses, and initially we said cell responses may be in different forms. One is this metabolism, synthesis of more glucose transporters, protein synthesis, fat synthesis, glycogen synthesis, and indirectly by interacting with the nuclear mechanisms, growth and gene expression also occurs. But classification here is based on direct link with tyrosine kinase enzyme. Therefore, it is enzyme linked receptor. And for other receptors also, there will be kinase enzymes, and in that case other protein kinases are involved, and here most common one is tyrosine kinase. Now, activation of intracellular receptors. Till now the receptors were surface receptors on the cell membrane. They are cell membrane proteins actually. Now the intracellular receptors, their activation leads to gene transcription. They interact with the DNA to produce certain type of mRNA, and then protein synthesis. And as this mechanism involves multiple steps, it is longer than other mechanisms. It takes more time. Therefore, once there is interaction between the receptor and the hormone, it may take minutes, even hours, and even days before the effect or cell response is seen, because new proteins have to be synthesized through this transcription translation mechanism. And you know the intracellular receptors are for lipid soluble messengers like steroid hormones and thyroid hormones. And see this figure. Lipophilic hormones means lipid soluble hormones. They diffuse through the cell membrane because most of the surface area of the cell is lipid. And once inside, some of them, for example, for steroid hormones, there are cytoplasmic receptors. The hormone binds with cytoplasmic receptor, and the complex is carried into the nucleus, and there it interacts with hormone response element of the DNA, part of the DNA that responds to hormone, and then transcription of mRNA, and then translation of proteins occurs. And the response is protein synthesis, and remember, these proteins may be structural or enzymes also. Enzymes are also proteins, And synthesis of enzymes is also a common mechanism, and those enzymes will catalyze other reactions or even formation of other enzymes. And in case of hormones having nuclear receptors, here the hormone will be lipophilic or lipid soluble, say thyroid hormone. It refuses into the cell cytoplasm and then refuses into the nucleus, and the receptor is inside the nucleus. And this nuclear hormone receptor complex then interacts with the hormone response element, and finally the same output, that is synthesis of protein. It may be enzyme or other proteins. Any questions till now? Now try to answer this one. Okay. Most of you have answered D, and it is correct. Which of the following receptor types are present inside the cell rather than on the cell membrane? Ion channel linked receptors, G protein coupled receptors, and enzyme linked receptors. They are all cell surface receptors. And these nuclear receptors, as the name suggests, they are inside the nucleus, or some say even the cytoplasmic receptors as nuclear receptors. It is same thing, and according to the context you will know what they are talking about. And these nuclear receptors are found within the nucleus. Therefore the correct answer is D. Okay, good. How do you defend your answer? In other cases, in cases other than intracellular receptors or nuclear receptors, the mechanism is either opening or closing of ion channels or activation of enzymes. And this process is not time-taking, but the events through nuclear receptors or cytoplasmic receptors they need to form new proteins. Therefore, it takes time. Therefore, these are the stressed. This is the advantage of having this knowledge, location of receptors and mechanism. For example, if we give insulin to a patient, the response will be fast. Or when we give adrenaline, for example, which uses G protein coupled receptors, the activation and response occurs within seconds. But in case of nuclear receptors, for example, thyroid hormone receptors, their activation may take some days to produce the effect. Therefore, you will not expect sudden change in pathology or physiology after administration of thyroid hormone, but we expect immediate effect after administering adrenaline. Now, second messengers, and we will finish within about 5 minutes. Second messengers. Why are they called second messengers? These are substances that mediate intracellular effects after receptor activation by the first messenger. The first messengers are the intercellular, between cells. First messenger, intercellular, between cell messengers, maybe hormones or neurotransmitters or others. Second messengers are similar chemical messengers, but they occur inside the cell. Once there is activation of the receptor, it mediates a series of events inside the cell, and that also involves some messengers, chemical substances, messengers between different parts of the cell, intracellular compartments, and this is produced by second messengers. These are intracellular messengers. Simply, first messengers are intercellular messengers, second messengers are intracellular messengers. They take the message of activation of the receptor to the final chemical reactions or response in the cell. Examples are cyclic AMP, calcium ions, inositol triphosphate or diacylglycerol. These 3 and 4, they are produced from phospholipids in the cell membrane. Therefore, they are together. Sometimes they are together called phospholipase second messenger system also. Anyway, try to remember name of these second messengers. In this case, there is again example of anti-diabetic hormone, also called vasopressin. Its action in the collecting duct cells. See here in the tubular lumen site, that contains urine to be formed urine, and the mechanism is the vasopressin receptors. Here the type is B. Vasopressin receptor also has different types, B1 and B2. Here it is epithelial type of receptors. Okay, and activation of this receptor activates adenylyl cyclase enzyme, which forms cyclic AMP from ATP, and this cyclic AMP mediates the intracellular action. Therefore, it is called second messenger. It causes phosphorylation of some other enzymes or proteins, and then finally there is more synthesis of these aquaporin channels, and then they are transported to the cell membrane, forming new aquaporin channels here, and then there will be more reabsorption of water. The main point here is an example of cyclic AMP as a second messenger, and it is very common in many other cases also. It will act as second messenger. Now try to study the examples for this GAG and IP3 also, the third and fourth one here. Okay, you will study from your book. Calcium ions are also very important and common, and you have already seen their role in muscle contraction. You can give that example. Here you will give examples for smooth muscles and cardiac muscles. Now try to attempt this question. All of the following are the extracellular messengers for communication among cells, except all of these are intracellular messengers, except second messengers. They are intracellular. We have already seen the intercellular, between cell messengers are neurotransmitters or hormones or paracrine substances, in some cases cytokine cells. Therefore the answer is second messenger. Just remember, second messengers are intracellular, inside cell messengers, and first messengers are either hormones or neurotransmitters. And first messenger, the term first messenger is not very commonly used, but second messenger is very, very common. This term you have to know, second messenger, intracellular. All of the following are among common second messengers, except, okay, good. The answer is B, acetylcholine. It is first messenger, neurotransmitter. Calcium ions, cyclic AMP, IP3 and GAG, they are common second messengers or intracellular messengers. Okay, good, very good. Now next we will talk about clearance of hormones and regulation of hormone activity, and then we will try to extract hypothalamic hormones. Any questions? Today we talked about general mechanism of activation of the receptors or general mechanism of action of hormones, and try to remember the different types of receptors according to location, cell surface and intracellular. Intracellular again cytoplasmic and nuclear. Cytoplasmic and nuclear receptors, they are receptors for lipid soluble hormones. Cytoplasmic for steroid hormones and nuclear for thyroid hormones. All others, they are surface, cell membrane surface receptors. And cell surface receptors, there are again three types, and the three cell surface receptor types are ion channel linked, enzyme linked and G protein linked, or more commonly called G protein coupled receptors. Okay, and second messengers are intracellular messengers. Examples: calcium ion, cyclic AMP, IP3, GAG, or phospholipase C mechanism. And there is one question: thyroid hormones are lipid soluble, but TSH is it water soluble? Yes. Thyroid hormones, when we say about thyroid hormones, we mean thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. It is water soluble as peptide hormone and water soluble. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask by mail or Viber, or we can ask in our next class. Okay, thank you very much and stay safe.